Okay, you're right. Can you? No.
Yes, muted, I think.
Couldn't hear Ryan.
Yeah. Oh, he might be popping over. I think we're just waiting for Sam. Oh, there it is.
Okay, great. Thank you all for being here on this special meeting. I know that we had to cancel the prior one, and I was trying to get us back on track, at least in terms of the items that were on the agenda. And I appreciate my colleagues making time to do this now. I'm working for the state. It's not very flexible in terms of for timing, but there's other benefits, so I appreciate that. I see that we have everybody here. Let's see. So the first agenda item of calling the meeting to order. It's 1:03. Is there anybody that's said that they wanted to provide public comment?
Didn't receive any.
Okay. Has everybody had a chance to look at the May 28th, 2024 meeting minutes?
I have.
Any corrections, adjustments?
No.
I'll
Okay.
move them if you'd like.
Please.
I'd like to move the minutes for May 28th, 2024. Accept them as is.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Awesome. Thank you. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
It's unanimous. Great. Thank you. Okay, that brings us to the next topic, which is the non-union compensation for fiscal year 24-25. Rita, do you want to get us started with that?
Sure, thank you. So as you may recall, the town council is responsible under our personnel rules for establishing and setting our various pay plans. And for our non-union employees, because they are not in a collective bargaining agreement, you typically do that on an annual basis for what we refer to as the town administrator's pay plan. Again, that's our non-union staff. That currently covers a fairly large group of staff members, about 48 employees in total. So again, a fairly large group of staff members for us. One of the items that Ryan and I will typically take a look at is statewide general wage increase data. We're very fortunate in that the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities does gather that information, and they typically report out on that monthly for us. And right now, and that we use that again just for external comparison purposes. And the average for that is currently 2.58%. During the budgeting process, based on data we were seeing, we did set aside and recommend a 2.6% general wage increase for our staff. So I think, that's almost exact. So I feel like we did a pretty good job in our estimates during the budget process. So we are recommending a 2.6% general wage increase for our non-union staff for the upcoming fiscal year. And again, that was budgeted as part of the adopted budget for July 1st. So we would not experience a negative budgetary impact. Two other points I do just want to make is that when we have created new classifications to add to the town administrator's pay plan, we have typically brought that to you again for inclusion and creation into the pay plan. And one of the new service improvements that was adopted as part of the budget process was the deputy fire chief of operations. So again, we did some analysis on that, and we are recommending that that position be established at grade 24 of the pay plan. So that is included in that pay plan attachment for you. And we are also recommending the creation of an assistant library director classification. Over time, we have a staff member. We did a reclassification review and really felt that the duties of a particular staff member have grown into a true, essentially number two person for that particular department. We felt a very good internal comparable classification for that position was our Assistant Parks and Recreation Director position, which was previously at grade 22 of the town administrator's pay plan. So we have
Oh.
proposed.
I hate to interrupt you. It looks like we lost Counselor Coleman. So I
Okay.
just want to reach out and see if he is,
Is Paulina running?
No,
It's just a code.
yeah,
So you just double check, make sure it doesn't.
Yeah. let's
yeah,
just,
he's not listed as a participant. So
No.
just one moment. I just want to pause real quick.
Okay.
All right, I texted him. Let's see if what's going on.
he's
But
coming back.
Oh, he's coming back?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I just didn't want you to have to repeat yourself.
Thank
once
you.
in. Yeah. All right, perfect.
There we
We paused once we noticed that you weren't in. I didn't know if you're having technical difficulties.
I had a blue screen of death. I haven't had one of those in years.
Yeah.
So I'm back for now.
Okay. Ray, you want to pick up where you left off, please? And if Counselor Coleman, if you have any questions or I'm not sure where you cut out. I think I caught it pretty quickly, but just in case.
I got cut out right at the end of the approval of minutes.
Oh, okay. So can you go back to the part about comparing the wage increase percentage with what was it? What was the organization? I'm having a
CCM.
thank you, CCM. I didn't know if it was them or cost. So can you start there, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was sharing that we will typically look at external market data as part of our, just a factor in our decision-making process around the general wage increase, and that we're very fortunate. CCM collects that data for us. It's the negotiated settlement data. Right now, based on the most recent data they have, that settlement data is coming in around 2.58%. We budgeted 2.6% during the budget process. So we were very fortunate that our estimate was so close to that statewide average that we're seeing. So if the 2.6% general wage increase that we are recommending is in fact approved by the council, there will not be a negative budgetary impact because those funds were already provided for as part of the budgeting process. I had also.
Can I ask questions? Is it easier for us to wait to the end of what you're presenting or to ask you as we have them?
Oh, and Tony looks like she's going to be joining us. I can take questions as we're going along if that's easier for you.
Perfect. For my colleagues, feel free just to somehow indicate they have a question. I'd like to make this a little bit more informal, just given how hot it is. And I, again, appreciate everyone's flexibility. Welcome, Mayor Moran. We're just discussing. Welcome, Mayor Moran. We're just discussing the union non-union wage increase, and my question is, so the 2.58%, is that something that like other towns have had a higher amount and other towns have had a lower amount? So that's what you mean by average? Is it median or is it like just a strict average?
Yeah, that's the average. And double check the attachment. The sample size was, let's see. So the sample size right now, that's amongst 173 settled contracts. And the average was 2.58%.
And that's non-union contracts?
That's union contracts.
Union
They
contracts.
a data
Okay.
for non-union staff, but we've generally always found that the negotiated settlement data does provide us with a good touch point.
And for Mansfield's unions, remind me, how many are there?
Sure, we only have 3 here.
That's what I thought.
And the fire union has a settled contract for the upcoming fiscal year. And professional, technical, and public works, we are currently negotiating with.
And the third one?
Professional and technical and public works,
Oh,
they're
oh.
technically 2 separate groups, but they
Yep.
do have the same parent organization.
And thank you. For the one that the firefighters that was settled, what is the annual increase that they negotiated? Was it 2.5?
It is 2.5% for the current year, although, I'm sorry, for the upcoming year, the fiscal year we're still setting in, their GWI was a little higher than the rest of our workforce.
I remember that. And so, given the negotiations with the professionals and the public works, are we able to talk about any of those negotiations right now, specifically, or is that something that is not for public consumption yet?
Correct.
The
That would be,
latter.
yeah, a non-noticed meeting.
Yeah, don't you ladder? I'm not a grammar guy. Which one is it?
The second, the non-noticed. option.
Don't tell my mom because she's a writer. Counselor Coleman.
I see that this is state average of roughly rounding up 2.6%. But seeing that we're in negotiations with other labor unions across the town here in different departments, should we not wait until those contracts are ratified and signed? Or is it necessary to step ahead of the negotiations with the non-union employees?
What I guess a good way to my interpretation of that, Counselor Coleman, tell me if I'm wrong, is what happens if we wait and don't act on this until after the negotiations with the unions?
Sure. We have done that sometimes in the past. And the non-union staff would receive what we would refer to as a retroactive wage increase.
Okay, and for these union negotiations that are occurring, are they for next fiscal year, not the one that begins July 1st? Are they for?
They are for
They
this
are,
July 1st. So by the
Okay.
time, by the time they're settled, clearly, there'll be a retroactive component for those. I think maybe I would just add a couple things to what Maria was, just saying.
Sure.
Understand, like, philosophically, the argument or rationale for tending to the non-union staff now. One, when you're not in a bargaining unit, obviously, there it's a little bit of apples and oranges, right? So there are benefits, value, if you will, that you get from being in a bargaining unit, and then there are times when not being in a bargaining unit, you don't get those things, and vice versa. So really, we view this as philosophically, it's a reasonable separation that should be made. That the fate of one, shouldn't necessarily be tied to the other. That there are benefits, value, if you will, that non-union employees forego by virtue of not being in a bargaining unit that the union employees get. And so not delaying on the non-union side, there's an argument to be made for that reason. And then secondarily, again, we're not going to get into the nuts and bolts of any pending negotiation with the union personnel, but suffice it to say, just in a very sort of broad statement, that we think doing this now in this way, putting a marker in the sand, so to speak, on the non-union side, will be beneficial as we move forward in our negotiations with the unions.
Mary Moran?
I have both a question and a statement. Clearly, whoever gets the first settlement sets the standard for all of the others. You either negotiate above or, and every other union following that will try to negotiate above that amount. Of course, if the unions get more than the non-union people, that creates a little bit of annoyance on the part of the non-union staff. It's very hard for a management team to negotiate a number lower than that because you have already signaled you're willing to pay that. So on the one hand, it does help to keep negotiations down. I mean, for a union to come in with a 3.5 at this point makes it look a little foolish. But on the other hand, so does coming in with a 2% raise. So by setting this standard, by setting this number, we have actually set a standard for the negotiations around which we will negotiate. But my question was, this average, is it a CCM calculation, Maria?
Yes.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, so were they calculating based on contracts settled over the contracts negotiated last year to cover this year are different from contracts that were negotiated 2 or 3 years ago? And I'm
Yes.
wondering if there's any distinction between those negotiated during the current year and others.
Right, so we don't receive that detailed of a breakdown, but they do update this data monthly for us. So as contracts continue to settle, right, sometimes contracts are in arrears, et cetera. But as contracts continue to settle, we do receive this data updated on a monthly basis.
So are the numbers going up or down?
They've been staying fairly consistent. We've been seeing numbers, I would say, at least for the last 6 months or so, in the neighborhood of 2.55 to 2.6. And that, looking at that data was how we came to our budgetary number to place in contingency for the upcoming fiscal year. So, within less than 0.1%, I would say we've been seeing that average number move over the last 6 months or so.
And
Thank you.
so the data that you have, what is the time frame on that table if you have that? And then Councilor Coleman after.
Yep, so it was in your packet on page, sorry.
7, This was labeled.
Page 15 of the PDF. And they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9 different fiscal years listed, going backwards and looking ahead as well.
Right, so my interpretation, my understanding of this data, and Maria can certainly correct me if I have it wrong, but since we're talking right now about FY 24-25, so when you look at the column on this page, there's the table that's the general wage increase by fiscal year negotiated settlements. So you have an average at the top for FY 24-25. That number, that 2.58%, would be a combination of both contracts, multi-year contracts that were settled in previous years that established that percentage. So like, let's say that was year 3 of a 3-year agreement in a contract that was negotiated a couple of years ago for a given town's bargaining unit. And then their number was 2.6%. It would be carrying over from that for ones that were settled, but for which it would apply to the coming year, as well as brand new, recently settled contracts for which this would be like the first year of a 3-year agreement. So some of the data informing that 2.58 would be like brand new, springtime negotiations that settled for July 1st coming up, as well as previous years for which that might be an out year that was captured. So, but as Maria said, it's updated monthly. So I think, we're using the best and most reliable up-to-date information we have. It's not perfect information, but it's pretty darn good.
Thank you. Councilor Coleman?
Thank you. Now, the other contracts that are being negotiated with the union, are they 1, 2, or 3-year contracts?
You're talking about our unions?
They
Yes.
They are currently 3-year contracts. With the exception of some times of economic uncertainty, as a practice, we ordinarily do 3-year contracts. But again, just want to be careful about getting into too many specifics about current negotiations that are underway. But generally speaking, our practice here has been 3-year
Yeah, that's
contracts.
the way I would put it, that the practice, if you look back retrospectively, very common occurrence for a 3-year time frame.
I still view this as showing our hand a little bit to the union, so I'm cautious there. I'm also cautious as to how the town manager is actually participating in negotiating his raise as well as his subordinate raises. I take a little, I'm confused to why he's even part of this meeting. But one last thing I'd like to say is we should hold off until the contracts are signed, and then off years is fine to do it before July 1. But I would recommend that we hold off.
Well, I think that my understanding in response to that, Counselor Coleman, is that if we, by doing this, we kind of can use it as part of the negotiations to say, if you're to the unions, if you're asking for a 10% increase, and I don't have any idea that they are, and I'm just using a random number, then we can point to the non-union wage increase and say, well, non-union increase is the 2.6 if we approve that. And so it's kind of a requested negotiating aspect tool, and that it's in line with what CCM's data has in terms of what has been updated monthly. Not trying to influence, but I think talking it out for me is a little helpful. Dr. Khan.
I'm a little bit conflicted as well. Not pro-union, not pro-non-union. Just staying in the middle with this. It would appear, though, that our greatest negotiation power would be to settle with the collective bargaining unions first, then to the non-union, because we're not going to bump the non-union participants higher than
Right.
that just gives them more leverage to keep going back and forth to the table and us to keep that going, which is what we want to kind of avoid. We want to have some controls over how much, wiggle room that we
And
have.
Can
You
I
know,
can I ask something before you go on? So just because I want to make sure I don't lose this, and correct me if I have this wrong. But if we don't take action and the negotiations between the unions then come back at 3.5%, we then risk having to do more for our non-union wage earners, because obviously we don't want to have such a discrepancy that that maybe their subordinates are making more than them, and that sort of deal. But what are does that make sense? Do I have that correct?
I'll weigh in on that. I mean, I think that you're applying very good rational thinking to that. I think that absolutely, if contracts were settled at a higher percentage and the non-union general wage increase had not already been administered, it wasn't in the rearview mirror, that there would absolutely be an expectation, and understandably so, amongst our non-union people for parity and equity, and not wanting to feel like they were disadvantaged in some way, and being non-union personnel would be looking at that percentage and saying, okay, so this is what would be fair and reasonable for us. I understand the argument that's being, or the reason, logic that's being applied in terms of how it could cut both ways in terms of which kind of goes first. And you know, it's hard to address this without getting into negotiating tactics that we're not going to get into, we won't get into, but I guess I would just suffice it to say in general phraseology here that staff management absolutely believes that by approaching it this way, with the non-union personnel general wage increase first, that this will, from a strategy standpoint, will prove beneficial for our negotiations with the union as opposed to relying on the reverse.
Okay, so I hear where you're coming from, and I don't agree at all, but we'll see how it falls out. I think it may put us in an unenviable position of the back and forth that we're trying to avoid. The second thing was a reference to, can a town manager be involved in this process? I believe that he can separate himself and be detached enough to give us an informed opinion based on his experience and management practices to date, as well as the many resources that he draws upon to come up with such decisions. So I don't have an issue with that part. That's it.
All right, I'm sorry to have interrupted you before, and thank you for letting me so that we could address that first part. I saw Counselor Coleman's hand first, Mayor Moran, unless it's something that Counselor Cotton has said, can I call and identify, recognize him first, please?
Sure.
Okay, go ahead.
You calling on me?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Well, as far as the town manager, I do see conflict of interest there, but really what I want to state next is the obvious. What, you know, it's like, really, we are showing our hands. You know, really, what's wrong with us? This should be done in an executive session from the get-go. First of all, we're negotiating wages, and we're showing our hands to unions. This most certainly could be discussed in executive session. No trouble at all. I'm sorry that we didn't start there. Maybe perhaps we should take it there.
Staff's just gonna clarify that.
Mr. Bruder?
Yeah, I'm gonna recognize Mayor Moran, and then we can see if there's more clarification needed.
There is some, I do have some concern about the discussion of negotiation tactics in open session. However, it's not subject to an executive session. It has to be subject to a non-noticed meeting according to the law. Collective bargaining is not one of the topics you can do in an executive session according to the Freedom of Information Act. So, but that's a different question. My other issue is that that labor relations is one of the major functions of a town manager, and the town manager is often the last or next to last step in a grievance procedure before going to court. Town managers everywhere are expected to be engaged in collective bargaining. I know that there have been people who have questioned whether it's a conflict of interest, but that's what we hire town managers for. It's one of those things that looks a little odd, but it is not, in fact, because that's the way the system works. We certainly would not want to turn this responsibility over to somebody who is hired by the town or who volunteers. The person who is answerable to the council is the town manager, and that's the person we put into this role. With the assistance of labor attorneys, of course, and in this case, with the assistance of the Director of Shared Services. So both of whom would be, I mean, you can carry it a little further that nobody who is employed by the town can do the collective bargaining on behalf of the town, which would really put you in a non-position. Anyway, however you decide to go on this one, is okay with me.
One sec. Counselor Coleman, does that address your concerns or your points? Or do you want Maria to provide more?
I still feel, I feel like it's wrong. I understand what the mayor is saying. I don't know if there's an alternative to it. Perhaps there is. Maybe look into the options of that in the future. I
And
know we had
Can I-
Mr. Palmer here last year, you know, I would think that maybe you could get outside consultation to take care of that in the future. I don't think we can do it today.
Counselor Coleman, if I could just clarify, when you're saying a different process, are you referring to not having staff part of the negotiations for
Any,
non-union?
any beneficiary to a raise in a non-union contract should not be involved.
I hear what you're saying. I just, working for the state, it's the same thing at that level. There's not some entity or organization that you can hire to do those negotiations. I mean, they're not unionized. By definition, they don't have a representative that they would, that we would interact with to do those negotiations. So it's kind of, I mean, that's why it tends to be the higher echelons of supervision, I mean, I don't also want to have to pay somebody else that doesn't have any necessary skin in the game, as a way to put it, that is going to be negotiating with, again, it'd be individually with each of the non-union members. Is really what
It wouldn't be an individual basis. It would be
But
the
they're
same
not-
thing we're doing today.
But
Um,
who's
I,
gonna,
like I said,
represent?
let's go forward with what we got today. I'll do some more research and I can bring it to the committee on a later date.
Yeah, I certainly would be happy to, if I'm wrong and you find, not even that if I'm wrong, if I'm mistaken or whatever the classification, if you find other information or have a different process that you want to have us review, possibly entertain to use in the future, I'm all on board. I just don't know of it myself.
Correct. We're here today and we have business that we need to conclude, but I did want to bring those things up.
I get that. That makes sense. Okay. So Maria, you still have something you want to address?
Yes, if I could, it just might help provide a bit more context. So I did just want to point out that on page 5 of your electronic packet, for transparency purposes, we do include a disclosure statement that while we are preparing this recommendation, we would in fact, right, also receive the increase if it were if it were to be awarded. And that's just, unfortunately, I think Sam did a nice job describing it, but just the way we are structured, and this goes back decades, right? The town manager and the assistant town manager, now my position, look at internal data, external data, right? We put together a recommendation for you. We ultimately do benefit from that, but for transparency and disclosure purposes, we did also note that and document that in the public materials for the public. We really do try to, again, to be very transparent about that, but we also felt it's important to provide the attachments that we did to show that this is in line with market data and it's nothing out of the ordinary or sort of extraordinary, if you will.
Right. And I appreciate that. And I think that it also goes to our function as the personnel committee to assess what information we're getting from staff, and our general interaction with the town agencies that are going to be, whether that be the library. I'm just going to signal that out because it's a fun place to go to. But if we're enjoying what is happening in this town in terms of all the different departments, I do think it's appropriate to recognize through wage increases for both the town manager, the director of shared services, and down the line. If certainly part of my weighing of this, and I'll put it out there, is if we didn't have the funds for it, or if we were making cuts in other things, certainly wouldn't want to be awarding any increases out of line with maybe what the unions are getting. But I hear what the recommendations are. I at this point feel comfortable with the. I feel like my questions and my concerns and have been addressed. Does any other council member have any that they wish to raise? Not before we vote, but just before we move on, because I see that the motion in the packet is put together, and I hate to say this, but I do have a hard 2:00 that I have to go, because I can always pause and see if my supervisor will let me put in some vacation time. But I know I'm dressed down, but I am still on the clock. Right now is my lunch hour. So does anybody have anything else they need to address with the general wage increases?
Just if I could, Sam, I just wanted to clarify one other thing in addressing concern that Mr. Coleman raised, just about having, if I understood the comment correctly, having this conversation in public session, so to speak. So as the mayor pointed out, the negotiations for collective bargaining units, discussions about those negotiations, as the mayor said, don't happen in an executive session, because that's not a qualifying reason. They would happen in a non-noticed meeting. But just the point I wanted to make is, when it comes to, if you want to call it negotiation, but a discussion about the general wage increase for non-union, under neither case would we be eligible or able to have that discussion in a non-noticed meeting or an executive session. That discussion has to happen the way we're having it now. So I just want to say, like, procedurally, strategically, there wasn't failure, oversight made. This conversation that we're having now about non-union staff as an aggregate about general wage increase has to happen this way. That's all. Thank you.
So
Okay.
you're saying, I'm sorry, I got one last question here. You're saying that in the future, we can't take this sort of discussion in a non-notice or an executive session?
I'm saying for non-union personnel, for this group of employees that we're talking about that this applies to, we couldn't discuss non-union general wage increase in an executive session or a non-notice meeting the way we could or would strategy for negotiations with collective bargaining agreements.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So seeing no other questions, concerns with the general wage, before we get to the motion, I think we also have, and I skipped the creation of the assistant library director and deputy chief, fire chief. But if we could move on to those.
Sure, thank you. Yes. So I was sharing earlier that since the town council does approve the town administrator's pay plan, we have had a practice when a new non-union classification is created, is then for the town council to set a pay grade for that new classification. There were two that we were recommending as part of our pay plan that is presented to you. One was the deputy fire chief of operations, which the budgetary funds were provided for following town meeting for July 1st. But again, that is a new classification, of which we have recommended a grade 24 on the town administrator's pay plan. And looking at a reclassification of an existing position to assistant library director. And our recommendation is to place that on grade 22 of the town administrator's pay plan. A good internal comparable for that particular position was our assistant parks and recreation director position, which was at previously grade 22 of the town administrator's pay plan. And that we felt, again, was the most comparable internal position. So again, those two particular new classifications, we're recommending the official creation of the classifications and incorporation into the town administrator's pay plan.
Okay, great. Sounds like we're being consistent with past practice and with our current practice. And any questions on the pay scales by colleagues?
Is there a motion for this?
There is, but I still wanted to also, because I know that the deputy fire chief position, I had a couple of questions about the actual job descriptions before we voted on it. I'm going to be in favor of it. I had some questions before we move forward. Did you have any questions on like the pay scale itself?
The assistant library director, what is the pay scale for that position? I heard it was a 22, right? I don't
Yeah,
have the paperwork in front of me, I'm sorry.
you're asking for the actual the number of what the 22 is?
Pay grade 22, it is a 35-hour work week. As proposed with the GWI applied, it would be a minimum of 83,951 a year to a maximum of $109,054 a year.
And you said that was consistent with the assistant director of Parks and Rec.
That classification correct. And our Public Works Operations Manager position is currently also classified as a grade 22. Although that's based on a 40-hour work week. So if you were to look at the range, it looks a little differently.
Okay. So for the, sorry, assistant library director, since we're talking about that, what is the, and I'm sure, what is the job description type requirements?
Sure. So we shared with you the draft job description on page 8. But essentially, it is a reclassification of one of our professional librarians to an assistant library director. So an individual has essentially the ability to step in for the director in the director's absence and truly function as the second in command for the department. And again, we have an individual over time whose just duties and responsibilities have grown, and the individual has been functioning essentially in that capacity without the pay. So after looking at that, we are recommending that we rectify that through a reclassification of the position.
Yeah, so just to be clear, I think everybody here is clear on it, but if anybody, the public is listening to this after the fact, so right now we have a systems librarian. So this position, as Maria just said, in practice, the person occupying that position has taken on these added duties and responsibilities that are reflected in the assistant director position. So we're not adding a position, we are reclassifying, upgrading, if you will, the systems librarian position to be an assistant director position. So it'll have all the responsibilities that were previously associated with the systems librarian, plus these higher level managerial and administrative responsibilities that, again, in practice, they have been executing for some time.
Okay, I thank you for the reminder. And Councilor Cotton, I see you have your hand raised.
Yes, I was looking at the assistant librarian position. Obviously, I was looking at the equal opportunity ADA statement that's at the bottom. And then I looked at what were believed to be the working conditions and the physical and mental requirements. And it occurred to me, when you say that to be the librarian, assistant librarian, someone's got to have a certain amount of physical strength, stamina, agility, visual and auditory acuity, and must maintain such physical fitness as to be able to perform the duties of the class. What struck me the most is how many people are eliminated from being able to hold that position as a librarian. Is it not a reasonable accommodation, for instance, to allow someone that may be in a wheelchair to function in this position? You may have some lowered counters or some cosmetic accommodations, reasonable accommodations that could be done that would allow someone with a disability to be able to do this job. But yet if I'm looking at what you have under the columns of occasionally have to do some of these duties, lifting, light lifting and whatnot, those things are possible from wheelchairs. And so it just wasn't clear to me that these are the actual working conditions and requirements necessary for this type of job. If we were talking a firefighter, we were talking a police officer, that's a different set of circumstances. But by its nature, being the librarian, in my mind, and it just may be my mind, doesn't rise to the level of physicality, even if a person had a visual disability. Accommodations are made for that all the time. And so that really kind of disturbed me. And I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I see what my colleague is referring to. Is there a way to, yeah, go ahead, please. Thank you.
Sure. So we do have essentially this piece to all of our job descriptions based on each particular classification. If we do have an employee who needs a potential accommodation, we will certainly engage in the ADA interactive process with our staff members. We have done that with staff members. We have made reasonable accommodations for staff members in the past. So that ADA interactive process is just something that we are, required by law to do, but certainly we just, want to make sure that we do that for our staff members. That is just, again, part of our standard practice. When we do our classification and compensation study, part of that will be looking at these and updating these for all of our jobs townwide as well.
So if they're not, if they're a staff member, that means they're already an employee. If their health were to deteriorate or they were to need accommodations, you would accommodate for that. If they're trying to get their foot in the door and put in an application, this, looking at what I'm seeing, would eliminate them from even being selected.
Not necessarily.
May I comment?
Please.
I haven't read the description in detail. However, if a person presents themselves and says, I can do that regardless of, I can lift 3 pounds or whatever it is, regardless of the fact that I have braces or I'm in a wheelchair, then they have a right to apply.
Apply, yes.
And then the challenge is to the hiring committee to act in an appropriate and affirmative way and consider them in terms of what they say they can do. But I think a librarian, especially in a small library, is required to move books, shelve things, help children. So I'm not surprised that there's a weight requirement here.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I think that even applies to a lot of like clerical state jobs, but that Mayor Moran is correct in that, someone's ability, if like, I don't want to get into too much detail, but we've had a staff member who was not able to, who needed accommodations, and the state was required to make it so that they were able to, because they could do the job that was required, we had to provide the accommodations to allow them to do it. And
Right.
I would expect the same from the town, and I don't imagine that would be any issue. But I hear what you're saying, and I'm assuming that this has gone through our labor attorney or had a review.
No.
Yeah.
So I guess one
Staying
thing,
from this conversation completely.
so one thing, just to, I guess if was unclear, if there's a gray area, little ambiguity, the the action that the Personnel Committee, the Council Personnel Committee is being asked to act on, consistent with the council's role and responsibilities, is the job classification, basically the compensation piece. The job description, which we obviously included as background because if we're talking about the job and the classification, what the pay should be, it makes sense for you all to have a clear picture of what exactly the job entails. So it's clearly related, pertinent information. But the Personnel Committee role is not to approve a job description. That's absolutely an operations and management decision. And so the feedback you're providing certainly helpful and things that we'll definitely take into account. But I just want to be clear that the crafted motion, what's being asked of the Personnel Committee is purely related to the compensation, for the classifying these positions and not the actual job description itself.
Okay.
Oh, we lose Mr. Bruder.
I appreciate that. I'm sorry, I hit the wrong button. I appreciate that clarification. I was thinking that we were reviewing the job description for approval as well, but it makes sense that that is a managerial function and responsibility. So, I mean, I do have a question about the deputy chief, fire chief, just in general sense, without having to get into like, are we approving things? But does anybody have any further questions about the assistant library director, knowing now that our function is the pay scales? Okay, so for the deputy fire chief, and this is just kind of, I'm just curious, is it something that, like, in a position like this, are we looking for someone who's going to only work in Mansfield? Because I'm still kind of learning how firefighters are evolving away from volunteers, and we're doing professional. And I know some work in multiple towns. It sounds like some of our firefighters work in multiple towns. Is this a position that you have to be a resident for? Is it one where it's contemplated, or is that not? If you could just kind of address some of that, I guess
Well,
was
I'll
curious.
start. Maria can fill in some other details. So I believe with this one, there's no residency requirement. There's a requirement that you live within 30 minutes of, I don't know if you pick a station.
Basically town line.
Town line, okay, so 30 minutes to the town line. To ensure, the ability to respond in a timely manner, obviously. If you're not working or on the clock or in town when something arises. Your question about, basically full-time attention and no other outside employment, it's just important to note that this is an administrative position, a daytime position with a more traditional work schedule, unlike the, I guess you'd say, unconventional work schedule that comes with being a full-time firefighter, where you're working 1 day on and 3 days off, the 24/7 schedule, which, by virtue of that scheduling, yields itself to potentially some other endeavors in those 3 days that you're not working. So I don't know that we have or discussed like there's a preclusion on outside or other, but I think just by virtue of the hours, the daytime hours the person's working, they can't be doing that in another neighboring town. So there wouldn't be that, conflict or overlap any different than it would be for, an engineer who works, daytime hours here in town hall. Was there another question you had, Mr. Brewer, or was that?
That covers everything. I appreciate it. I just kind of trying to understand the positions, and I appreciate that. And I'm comfortable with the pay scale.
Okay.
Does any of my colleagues have anything else related to the general wage increases or the pay scales as it relates to the two new positions?
I'm not gonna support the assistant library director position. There's over $800,000 worth of salaries there. I know this is a lieu of the system librarian. We're spending a lot of money on salaries there already.
Am I correct in understanding that this position has already been created, or are we voting on creating it?
You would be creating the
Yes.
classification of assistant library director. But as Ryan had indicated earlier, it's not in addition to, meaning we're not adding one new full-time position, it's in place of an existing. So the budgetary impact under our personnel rules, it would be a 10% salary increase for the individual being compensated. So relatively modest. The reclassification review has been underway, and I believe we did budget a potential contingency in the event that a reclassification was awarded.
So we're
Okay.
okaying the creation of the position, but not the working conditions under which it will be done. Is that correct?
Correct. You're creating the classification and essentially establishing the pay range and the pay grade for the position. The compensation is really the action that we need of the council ultimately.
I don't support the creation of the position itself.
Can I ask Counselor Coleman, is that because you're worried that down the line there may
Down the
be,
line, we're gonna end up picking up a assistant director of the library when I don't think we need one. And then
Even
you'll end up picking up a systems librarian, then you'll end up having two positions. So that's my concern. Like to run as status quo because salaries down there are
I hear
well
you.
over 100,000, almost up to where public safety was last year.
And if I could just clarify, if the library salaries remain unchanged, even with this additional position, would you support it?
Well, it opens up a new position, and you could backfill with another systems librarian. That's my concern.
So the position that is being vacated or the salary that's no longer going to be on the books, it could be added without approval of the town
Yes,
council.
you already have it. So that's my concern. I don't support it the way
I
we're.
get you.
Thank you.
Okay, so how do you feel about the deputy fire chief? If I
We've
if-
already hired him, so we budgeted for him, and and we agreed as a council on what we're gonna do with the fire department during budget season. So I do support that.
Okay, so I think that for the purposes of the motion, we should separate those two so that we can get an accurate reflection of the will of this committee. And so I think that we're ready to make the motion. I'm going to move effective June 20th to recommend a 2.6% general wage increase and the proposed changes in wages for non-union regular staff effective July 1st, 2024 as presented. And further move effective June 20th, 2024 to recommend the creation of the classification of deputy fire, I'm sorry. Can I just pause? Councilor Coleman, did you say you were going to support the 2.6 or not? And I'm only asking because I won't.
I'll support the 2.6, but there's some other things that I wanted to address in the future.
Okay, so I'm going to continue my motion of further move effective June 20th, 2024 to recommend the creation of the classification of Deputy Fire Chief of Operations as presented. Do I have a second? Councilor Coleman, thank you. And Councilor Cotton, I think I understood from the way you were. Is there any discussion? Let me put it that way to this
No
motion.
discussion.
Okay. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, so that part is unanimous. And then I would like to move effective June 20th, 2024 to recommend the creation of the classification of Assistant Library Director as presented. Do I have a second?
I'll second it.
Okay. Any discussion?
That's what I said earlier. My concern is we creating a new position that could be backfilled as systems librarian at a later date. So I don't support it.
Any other discussion? Okay, all those in favor, raise your hand. Okay, all those opposed? So 2 in favor, 1 opposed, and that means it'll get reported out to the town council, but again, we'll be able to address
Yeah.
any of the concerns, and including, I think that I'm including any other, aspects that we've already talked about today. I'll leave it at that. It is 2:02. I did get permission from my supervisor to put in for vacation time. I'd prefer not to have this go too much further, but I don't want to cut off too much of the town manager's performance review instrument and timeline. Do my colleagues anticipate that this is something that needs a fair amount of discussion? And if so, I'm happy to ask for that to be moved to another date. I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable or feeling like they have to, fit this in because of the timing. I appreciate people's flexibility with what we've done so far today.
What do we gotta give to the council on Monday?
Nothing in terms of the town manager's report, performance review. So that we have a timeline for trying to get this to our colleagues in August, and I think there's some. Maybe if we get Maria, if you could give us an update as to where we're at. I know we were having trouble getting into the SurveyMonkey account. Are we able to get into it?
I have not yet gone in to start making the updates, but at this point in the process, the group was just going to essentially take one final look at the instrument that you reviewed at your last meeting, just to make sure you didn't have any additional changes. So that was really the one takeaway we had left for this particular meeting, was just to make sure that we're in fact comfortable with the instrument that had been presented previously.
So if my 2 colleagues or anyone else that's on the town council has any discussion they want to have with the instrument, I remember there being discussion after that. I thought that some of my colleagues felt that it didn't provide enough flexibility or something. I can't remember exactly, but I know my main thing is wanting to ensure that any town council member that participates is their participation is anonymous. We do not want any staff members of town, much less the town manager, to be able to access what any town council member directly said. I mean, all of that will be summarized and put together, but I want colleagues to feel comfortable that they're able to be frank in what they are assessing of the town manager's performance. But does anybody have any changes to the questions or the format?
No, this seems very straightforward because you're really only having 9 members evaluate them, as opposed to what we did last year, that 360, where you have subordinates and others that have. So this is pretty straightforward and simple, I think, Sam.
Okay, and I will make a commitment to this committee that as of right now, I'm moving towards, or we're planning on using SurveyMonkey, with the caveat that it will allow our colleagues to remain anonymous. So if that's not the case, then I would say we would want to try to find a different instrument. It does sound like that is the case. We want to make sure that that is true before we put all the information in there and then get it set up and then find out that that was not the case. But I agree with Councilor Coleman. I think the questions are good from our perspective as town council members. It provides a comments section and a fair ranking system. So I'm comfortable with it as we are in terms of where we're at in this process. Councilor Cotton? Not that I'm trying to call on you to, call you out, but if you want to comment.
The only comment I have, I believed what we discussed was that several of the constructs, we would have to put either unable to rate or unobserved, given our position as town councilors, unless we've had direct communication on certain issues with, so some of us won't be able to, and that's just a given. So you will see a skew
Yeah, and
statistically when the results fall out. That's all.
And I see that is option 5 is strongly agree all the way down to 1 unable to rate, and I think that the questions with the comment boxes, so that if somebody wants to explain, just I haven't seen it in action, if they so feel, not that they're trying to provide a negative response, and we can probably discuss as a group whether we want to include unable to rate as a negative response. I mean, I can see where, if the town manager is supposed to provide us with an agenda, and I know he is, but just say he wasn't, and we're able to, we put unable to rate because he hasn't been, then that might be considered a negative, and that might be something that can be considered in the comment boxes. But strongly disagree, I think, would cover that. Mayor Moran.
Yeah.
There are things like relationships with employees that some people will say they have no way of knowing. And it
Right.
isn't a negative, it's just, I don't know. And it takes them away from doing something which is essentially dishonest, that is trying to find a rating when they really don't know. So it's an important element, but this shouldn't count for anything.
Okay, so then we can put that caveat to our colleagues when we were presenting this, that if you choose option 1, unable to rate, then it will not skew positive or negative
Right,
towards.
but it's usually put in at the last, as a last option, not as a first option.
I think in just looking at the format of the questions as they are in the packet, 5 is strongly agree down to 2 is strongly disagree, and 1 is unable to rate. So maybe we don't want to have the numbers in front of those so that it's not confusing in that sense. Maybe have a column with the strongly agree, and a column with disagree, strongly disagree, and then a separate somewhere that's not within the what looks like a ranking off to the side can be unable to rate type deal.
I would make it, if you have all your rankings going in the same direction, it puts a bias into the answers. So in fact, at some point you want to change the kinds of answers in order to make sure that there's reliability. And I would always put the not able at the very end
Understood.
as
But
irrelevant.
for right now, it sounds like we're good to go, and I have to go to I have to get off just momentarily. But Councilor
Sorry.
Coleman. No, it's okay.
I think the unable to rate stems from the 360 that we did last year, because many questions that are geared towards subordinates can't be answered, obviously, by counselors. Perhaps we can adjust the question so each question can be rated. I think that's where that column stems from, is that I couldn't possibly answer as a counselor a question that was directed at a subordinate. If I remember correctly, that's where that comes from.
All right, but for our purposes today, Maria, do you feel like you have enough to go confidently forward, and we can always do this level of detail at our next meeting?
Yeah, absolutely. I have enough. Thank you.
Okay, and so keep this in mind. This is not going away off of our agenda. It's just that for right now, the questions are gonna remain status quo, and we're gonna present it in such a way that it'll make it easy for our colleagues to rank effectively and communicate their review of his performance. Okay, with that, I would like to thank you all again. We will have the rules got sent, the rule change that we addressed for public comment got sent back to us. We're not going to do that today. It's not on the agenda, but I just want to make everyone aware that will be on our next meeting, whenever that is. And as well as let's put this ranking on there as well.
Okay.
All right. Thank you all. And motion to adjourn. Do I have a second?
I second it.
Oh, thank you very much. All those in favor? Aye. All right, it's unanimous. 212. Thank you all, and thank you, Maria. I hope you have a good day.